How's it going, Endless fans? It's another Wednesday, which means it's Whiteboard Wednesday time, and we're going to be talking about how we can distill and make a complex topic very simple, so much that I can get it up on a whiteboard. Today we're talking about how to save money on hotel Wi-Fi, so let's jump right on in. About 10 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, there used to be this saying that got said all the time around the industry, that if you don't use our hotel AV, there'll be some sort of fees associated. We call it hotel restrictions or hotel AV restrictions or in-house AV restrictions. Very, very common. You might have known this from like babysitting fees, electrical fees, all those sort of things to make it harder to not use the in-house AV company. Well, nowadays, 2018, we're seeing a really extremely common trend, and I was just at a conference literally this last weekend, and people were asking me this exact same question, that hotels are now saying, if you don't use our hotel hotel AV, now there will be $30,000 for hotel Wi-Fi. Hotels are learning that, hey, planners are realizing that it's hard to get Wi-Fi. They don't know where else to get it from, and they're realizing they can use that as the kind of linchpin or the choke pin to force the in-house AV company to do the AV, and also for them to get the business when it comes to Wi-Fi. Maybe they say something like, hey, we'll give you the Wi-Fi for free, but let's be honest, usually if it's free, it's probably going to be bad. So what I want to do is talk to you a little bit how you can save money when it comes to that hotel Wi-Fi and for your events, and how you can get by making sure you're getting exactly what you need for the right price, and that you're not forced again into any conversations where you have to choose one vendor just to save $30,000, right? So let's jump right on in with the first thing that I recommend is knowing some Wi-Fi basics. We did a webinar recently with Trade Show Internet and with Glisser, and which we'll link down below as part of this episode, which was how to improve your Wi-Fi. And we talk about what these basics are and kind of how to understand them. Things like, for example, speed, and understanding what involves with speed, not just necessarily the megabits per second, but also what the ping is and kind of these terms. I think it's important for you to know what the speeds are, because when you're having these conversations where they say, we'll give you free Wi-Fi or you're paying this much for Wi-Fi, you need to understand what exactly you're getting for that money. Other things as well is understanding, do you need wired versus wireless connections, and talking also with what you need the internet for. For example, if you're doing a live stream, potentially you're going to need a wired internet connection, and if you only order wireless connections, you might not be in good shape, so understanding that difference. Also knowing how many connections you do need, not just necessarily the number of connections for your attendees. We'll be talking a little bit later about how you can help reduce the number of connections you need for your attendees, but knowing how many connections in total. Think about also vendors and exhibitors, also all your AV vendors, anyone else that needs basically Wi-Fi, maybe not only just one laptop, but maybe two laptops you're going to need. All these sort of things all come into play. Also understanding the levels of security. When you're coming into these conversations talking about Wi-Fi, you want to make sure that you understand how secure it is. And we have done many webinars on cybersecurity, so you want to make sure that you have secure Wi-Fi, and happy to talk about it a little bit more. But also, what is the use of this Wi-Fi? Not only how many connections you need, wired versus wireless, but what's the use? Are you going to be doing live stream over it? Do you just need your attendees to be able to check their email? Are you doing any sort of like audience response systems, any sort of Q&A systems, that sort of stuff? You have to understand what exactly you're going to use it for. Just get your head around what the Wi-Fi is for. And then also the question of, is it dedicated or nah, right? Is it going to be dedicated? And the fact that, for example, if you're saying, hey, we need 100 connections, is that the same connections that the convention down the hall is going to be using that same internet connection, and when they all get in, it's going to slow down? Or is that a dedicated 100 connections for you? Also, is each Wi-Fi connection completely dedicated, or are they all shared? All these sort of things. So when it comes to the basics, keep in mind kind of these questions, and when you are talking about Wi-Fi and discussing what the pricing is going to look like, have all these questions and have a great discussion about what this is going to look like. Not just, hey, all of our attendees get a Wi-Fi connection, and then it turns out that it's slow, it's not dedicated, it's not secure, and by the way, you also need a wired connection. Ugh, can get a little scary. Also, number two, test it out before your big conference. with another big conference. I highly recommend this. As part of your site surveys, we obviously look to see what does the venue look like, what's the condition of the floors, is the food good, but we never seem to check the Wi-Fi. And we always seem to hear that Wi-Fi is always fast, right? Oh yeah, our internet's great, it's gonna be fantastic. But you know, you're spending a lot of money, and sometimes this can be as much as your catering budget, sometimes $30,000. So what you want to do is when you're doing your site visit, hopefully there's another big convention going on the exact same time as you, and if they are proposing that you are going to have internet, ask to use one of their connections. So you can kind of get the proof in the pudding, I guess you would say, and get a chance to see, is this Wi-Fi good? Two tools that I recommend. Everyone's heard of speedtest.net. That's kind of the go-to standard when it comes to doing a internet test. Fantastic, allows you to see the up speeds and the down speeds and the ping. But the one I highly recommend actually is fast.com. The reason why fast.com is better than speedtest is speedtest providers and internet providers have realized that if we make speedtest.net our fastest website and we allow everything to go through it, it looks like our internet's fast. However, fast.com uses Netflix's servers, and you obviously know that a lot of internet providers are going to throttle in Netflix, YouTube, all the big data-hungry services. So when you use fast.com, it uses Netflix servers, so you can see what do those speeds look like using a server that they might potentially be blocking or slowing down, which is fantastic. So check out fast.com. So get a nice big test, plug in your laptop, all that sort of stuff, and call them on their stuff, call them on their numbers that they provide. All right, a good tip as well is asking about the cell service and testing this yourself. A quick way, again, to save money when it comes to your Wi-Fi is that far too often we worry about the number of connections, making sure everyone can have a connection. We're talking, again, another suggestion I do is, but the question becomes, like, if the cell service is good enough, do you really need a ton of Wi-Fi, for example? Can people bring in their own hotspots? Can people use their phones? But if the venue that you're utilizing has poor cell reception, you're going to find more attendees are going to need to get on the Wi-Fi so they can just do simple things like checking their email, calling grandma, all that sort of stuff. So make sure that you check how good is the cell service in the venue that you are having, and can that potentially be a alleviator for the internet connections that you may have. So some good ideas so far. Let's get a little bit more into how you can save on number of connections. And this is this concept called Autologout. And this comes from our friend Ben at Glisser. And obviously, you can set up, using Wi-Fi, to set up a service that will automatically log people out after a certain period of time. So, for example, let's say it's an hour, maybe it's 2 hours of connection, it automatically disconnects. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, why would I want it to auto-disconnect my attendees? Won't that make them angry? Well, what's great about it is it creates churn. And churn is this idea of losing connections and losing users, essentially. And what this means is that if someone comes in and plugs their laptop in or puts their phone on and lets it go for 4 or 5 hours, and they don't realize they don't even need it anymore, it's downloading the Spotify updates and they're downloading their app updates and all these things like that, just running in the background in general. Well, what you might find is they may actually not need that service if they're not actively using it to check their email or participate in the audience response system. So what you can do is the Wi-Fi provider can set up an auto logout that automatically logs them out every 2 hours, which forces them to re-log in, which allows you to keep that number of connections lower. So imagine, let's say you have 3,000 attendees, but you only want to pay for 1,500 connections. You might not find that all 3,000 attendees need to use all the internet all at the same time. Maybe only 1,500 people need to. And then by using auto logout, it allows you to free up spots in number of connections for new people to log in as well. So, fantastic way to save money on a hotel Wi-Fi. Next up is creating sponsorship opportunities. We all know how to use Wi-Fi. We get the basic ideas of looking for like what's called the SSID or the network name and the password. Well, I've seen this as a fantastic use of sponsorships. At a recent conference we had, Puerto Rico actually sponsored a Wi-Fi network. It was called Puerto Rico, and then they put their saying as the Wi-Fi password. And what it meant is everybody was always asking, what's the Wi-Fi password? And it got everybody to say the brand name. This should be an opportunity that you sell to your sponsors. It allows you to make just even a little bit more money to allow you to offset those costs when it comes to the expensive Wi-Fi. What's fantastic as well is a lot of these have these login pages. Imagine turning that into another sponsorship opportunity, putting a graphic up. But let's even bring it further. Let's say you make it so they have to give their email address to give their Wi-Fi login. This allows it to turn into a lead gen opportunity for that sponsor as well, to collect email addresses. Again, probably figure out some sort of way to make make it worth it to people who give their email addresses though, because last thing you want to do is be stuck into a position where people are giving a bunch of fake email addresses, because I know I like to do that on those pages sometimes. So make it worth it for people to give their email addresses and turn it into a nice sponsorship opportunity to offset those costs. All right. Next up is to allow, this is one that's a little controversial, and obviously this depends on your conference and what you want, your objectives are, but maybe potentially allowing attendees and exhibitors to buy their own internet. The reason why this is important is that sometimes you have to ask yourself, is Wi-Fi the most important thing that we have to have our conference? Do people need to get into an honest response system? Do they need to be able to check their Wi-Fi internet? Do they need to call grandma? If you say to yourself, no, this conference is more about disconnecting and connecting with people or paying attention to the content, maybe you do not need to have free Wi-Fi. And I believe for most cases, people are going to say, I need to have free Wi-Fi, which is totally okay. Use all these other tactics. But if you believe you do not need to have free Wi-Fi for your attendees, again, be ready because some attendees will backlash at this. Maybe consider charging for that Wi-Fi. At minimum, exhibitors might be willing to pay for it since they're going there and paying for all that money already, but maybe even consider it allowing attendees. Another concept that you can have is a certain level of buyout. You can have a Wi-Fi. So for example, you could say to the Wi-Fi provider, hey, we'll pay for half of this. And what that will allow is that you can drop that price from $10 per day to $5 per day, or maybe we'll pay for a certain amount of it. You know, it allows you to drop the cost just a little bit lower. Again, this is up to your objectives and what you're trying to accomplish, but this might be an opportunity if you're really looking to save money to potentially do as well. Something to just keep in mind. All right, number 7 is utilizing a third-party vendor, which I'm going to put a little dance party with. What people don't realize, and we talked a lot about this during the webinar, is that you actually are capable of bringing in a third-party Wi-Fi provider. I'm going to repeat that again. You are capable of bringing in your own third-party Wi-Fi provider, just like you can bring in your own AV. However, to circle all the way back to back then when there's all these restrictions and things like that, that's very much where AV was back then, but now Wi-Fi has entered. Providers are starting to make it harder for you to realize that you can bring in a third-party vendor. In fact, if you negotiate, which we'll talk about in just a little bit later, if you negotiate up front, you can actually have a provider park a satellite truck right outside your venue, run a cable in, and even potentially utilize the existing infrastructure in the venue already. Again, you'll have to negotiate it ahead of time, but you do have the ability to bring in a third-party vendor. But you have to ask that question ahead of time, which is really important, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So keep that in mind. You can bring in a third-party vendor potentially to do all this. One idea that I've seen as well is not even just, let's say for example, you don't have the ability to bring in a third-party vendor 100%. At least utilizing that third-party vendor and telling them up front, like, hey, maybe I'll use you for the next vendor, but right now I can't utilize you. Can I at least use you as bait to be able to drop the price with against the in-house company, to bring that Wi-Fi price down and use it as leverage to essentially drop that price as well. So give that a consideration when it comes to it. Third-party vendors can help save your butt a lot of times, at least in understanding all the nuances and at least simplifying things a little bit more. All right, number 8. This one's going to seem like a duh, which is why I put duh to it, but just ask. If you are looking to save money on hotel Wi-Fi, the most minimum thing that you can do is ask. We know that obviously it can get really expensive, and it seems kind of obvious, but don't just assume that the venue is going to force you to pay that $30,000 bill for that Wi-Fi. Instead, ask them. Super duper simple. Make that ask, and don't allow it to just be that thing that you write off right away. We've seen that in a ton of times, and so many clients are willing to be able to do that. And obviously, if you are able to do that and you don't care, go ahead. But if you're looking to save money on Wi-Fi and that's why you're watching this, just go ahead and ask. On to our last and final tip, which is negotiating before you pick your venue. Brant Kruger has this great saying. Well, I guess this is a long time saying, but we say this in all of our sessions. If you are negotiating, is asking before the contract. After the contract, it's called begging. You don't want to be in a position where you're begging. Be in the position of negotiating. So when you are evaluating all of your venues and you're looking at which one's doing this, ask about Wi-Fi. Tell them you want, hey, I want to bring a third-party vendor for my AV, and I don't want to be charged up the front for Wi-Fi. Ask all these questions and have this entire conversation that we are having right now before you sign your contract. This will allow you to have the leverage to put it in place to get the best Wi-Fi with the best speeds, the best connections, everything like that. It allows you to create those sponsorship opportunities, do auto logouts, maybe even potentially bring in a third-party vendor instead before you sign the contract instead. So all of this information should hopefully be super duper helpful for you when it comes to picking and choosing your hotel Wi-Fi or looking to bring the cost down. So let's recap really, really quickly. First, know your Wi-Fi basics. Second, test it out during a big conference, before your conference, so you can make sure that it's running really smoothly during your site survey. Next, check out the cell service because it might be a potential for you to replace that instead of just providing a ton of Wi-Fi. Next, check into doing an auto logout, so then that way you can have a little bit more churn, so then that way not everyone's hogging all the Wi-Fi all day long. Potentially explore sponsorship opportunities for things like the name of the network, the login page, and maybe even lead gen collection with the emails. Next, maybe even considering, depending on what your goals are of your conference, allowing your attendees and exhibitors to buy their internet instead. Potentially looking to third-party vendors, obviously asking for a lower price, right? And then last but not least, negotiating all this ahead of time before you pick your venue rather than after. So again, this has been Will Curran from Endless Events, giving you another Whiteboard Wednesday on how to save money on your hotel Wi-Fi for your events. I hope this was super duper helpful. If you did, be sure to subscribe down below, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and we want to hear your feedback. Give us some feedback. Do you have any sort of tips when it comes to saving money when it comes to your hotel Wi-Fi? We'd love to hear it in the comments down below. Thank you guys again, and I hope you have a fantastic day, and we'll see you next Wednesday on Whiteboard Wednesday.